phone, please dial 1-669-254-5252. And when prompted, input the meeting ID 160-181-4948 pound. This information is also available on the agenda. All right. The next item on our agenda is electing a chair for this committee. This is the time for nominations only, no discussion. Following each nomination, the nominee will have the opportunity to provide a brief statement. And then we will take public comment, followed by committee member comment, and then we will take it to a vote. Are there any nominations from the committee members to nominate themselves or another member of the committee as chair?
I'll nominate Jeff for.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
I'll second
It's a very quick second. All right.
Yes.
Do the nominee want to make any comments or a brief statement?
I'll do my best to lead this committee for its stated purpose as codified in the ordinance, and got questions related to that. I'm sure we all do. So I'll do my best for the interest of this committee.
Thank you. All right, we'll now open to discussion on this matter. Do we have any public comments?
Yes.
All right.
Laurie Saldana?
Thank you. Thank you for accepting this. And as we know, San Diegans pay the highest utility rates in the country. We are sending $1 million a day out of our economic region. One reason that many of us have pushed very hard to have this oversight and compliance committee as part of this franchise agreement is we don't agree with the franchise agreement. We don't think it's a good deal for the citizens of San Diego. We think that we are paying too much and that is harming our economic vitality. We can't invest in the things that are important and the basic things. So I appreciate you taking on the responsibility to chair this committee. And you have the resources within the city to look very carefully at what we can do to improve matters when it comes to taking the burden off the backs of ratepayers who are increasingly not able to invest in their children's education, not able to buy food, not able to pay for housing. And every day we see that impact of that. So I'm here as a former state constitutional officer to remind people of just how serious this committee is and how detrimental the actions of this franchise agreement in terms of, and we have a state audit that's coming out, something I've used when I was in the legislature. And we really need to understand how we've gotten to this point where people literally cannot afford the cost of living in San Diego. So thank you for taking on this responsibility and look forward to your diligence in figuring out a path forward that's less harmful to San Diegans.
Thank you. Are there any other comment? Members of the public that are called in, you can also make public comment by raising your hand, using the raise your hand function on your computer, tablet, or smartphone, or by dialing *9 on your phone. And if it is your turn to speak, I will unmute you. All right. I'm not seeing any comment. All right. All right. Following, are there any comments from members of the committee? All right. I will ask each member by roll call to vote for one nominee. One nominee. If at the end of the vote, one nominee receives majority, the nominee will be elected chair, and at the end of the vote, if no one receives the majority of the vote, then we will do a runoff. All right. We'll now take a vote. Member Browning? Yes. Member Kowar?
Yes.
Member Quint?
Yes.
And Member Tomafulo?
Yes.
That is 4 in favor and 0 opposed.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Next item.
Speaking of, our next item on the agenda is electing a vice chair for this committee. Similarly, this is not a time for, it's only a time for nominations, no discussion following the nominations. Each nominee.
Hi.
We'll have the opportunity to provide a brief statement, and then we'll take public comment followed by committee member comment and then a vote. Are there any motions from the committee members to nominate themselves or another member as vice chair?
As the chair, I'd be glad to nominate Jared.
I second.
Thank you for your nominations. Do we have any public comment on the nomination?
Laura Sutherland.
So I wasn't sure who would be nominated, but I'm just going to pull out a bit of mailer that I received and public people in my district received. This is you, Jared?
It looks like me, yeah.
Okay.
Which district?
This is District 2. I ran for city council in District 2, and Jared, you misrepresented who you are and what you do to thousands of voters in San Diego. You said that you were the past president of the League of Conservation Voters. You never said that you were general counsel for BayWa, which I was criticized for opposing their project. You just lost almost over $6 million, I believe, in a jury trial for BayWa because their solar project in Valley Center contributed to runoff that damaged adjacent businesses. And now you want to build a BayWa project in Jocumba, and that's what I opposed. I didn't oppose solar. I opposed a project that will do harm. And if you're going to misrepresent who you are to the public in political matters and paid for by the mayor's PAC, and then the mayor appoints you to this committee, or maybe Sean Elo did, I'm not sure. I think you need to be held accountable to a higher standard of honesty and who you represent. And the fact that you wouldn't represent yourself in a political paid flyer tells me that you need to do a little bit better work in being a public official, because we are held to higher standards. And I say that as somebody who's no longer in office, but when I was a state constitutional officer, I would never have misrepresented my actual title and position at work. So I'm going to speak as a member of the public against you being in a leadership position on this oversight committee and ask that you find another person who's willing to take that on, that has demonstrated more honest and trustworthy behavior when it comes to interactions with the public.
Great, thank you. Are there any other members?
No other public comment.
One person.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, or whoever, Mr. Chair. Jay Powell, I have got a speaker slip here. Happy to submit that. I also wanted to express some concerns that some of Ms. Aldana expressed here regarding just the process. I was going to speak in unintended public comment, but I might as well do it now for how the nominations and the information has been provided to the public for this meeting. And I requested that background information on the board members here be provided to the public, and I have not seen that. And I'm concerned about the point that Ms. Aldana brought up here, and I think I would urge the other members of the committee to reconsider Mr. Queen's nomination for vice chair.
Thank you. Any other public comment? All right, looking online, we do have someone who has raised their hand for public comment. A reminder that if you have called in and would like to provide public comment, you may use the raise your hand function on your Zoom. I will unmute you when prompted. Moving to Danny Avita. Go ahead.
Hello, committee members. My name is Danny Avitia. I live in District 3, and I would also like to share the same concerns as Lori, former Assemblywoman Lori Saldana, with having Jared on this this committee. It's highly unethical the way he participates in political campaigns, the way he misrepresents himself to the public, the way he misrepresents himself to others, and the way he defames others. I am opposing him on this committee today. The way he conducts himself and the special interest he has in this will lead to many lawsuits in this city. So again, please make sure that you're doing the ethical leadership style of trying to do the city's business and not conducting yourself like Mr. Jared. Thank you very much.
All right, I don't see any other public comment online. Following committee member comments, I will add each member by roll call again to vote for one nominee in the chair. If at the end of the vote, one nominee receives a majority, that nominee will be elected to be vice chair. If at the end of the vote, no one receives a majority, then the top two will hold a runoff, or we'll have to reopen for nomination. The finalist receiving the majority will be elected vice chair. Are there any comments from committee members at this time?
I can make a comment. So I'm meeting everyone for the first time here. I don't have any of your backgrounds. Just for the record, I leave it up to you. You know, if you want to step away from it, I'm happy to nominate myself or let you nominate me if that, I just want it to go well. My role here is to serve the public and provide a good review of the franchise agreement. And we haven't done any backgrounds. I don't know if that's something that we can do, but it'd be nice to hear everyone's background. Those are my comments.
Any other committee member comments?
I just also add, I just met Jared and I didn't even have a chance to ask him if he wanted to serve as vice chair, and I just kind of put it right back on him. So I'd be happy to have him as vice chair, but if he'd rather
Sure.
toss it to somebody else, that's fine as well.
Yeah, no, so thank you all. I didn't want to be vice chair, but so I'd be happy to have someone else do it if someone else would rather do it. I'll just say that you know, obviously there were some comments made about me which are wholly untrue, and I'll just say that for backup purposes, I run a small business right now. I resigned from BayWa March of 2022, and so I haven't been employed by BayWa since March, and I was a past president of the Conservation Voters, and so I'll just leave it at that. But I'd be happy to have someone else serve if someone else would prefer. But I'm also happy to serve if folks in this committee want me to.
Any other comments?
Well, I guess let me just say, I'm going to nominate myself just in interest of just because nothing against you, but just in interest of the public comments that we've received, just so that we can get past that. My name is Jim Tomasulo. I retired about a year ago from Helix Water District. I was the chief engineer and director of engineering there and worked there for 22 years. A lot of experience with underground utilities, coordinating with SDG&E. So more of a technical background. That's my background. Happy to have the public comment against that if they'd like. And I'll nominate myself and we'll go through the roll call. Bridget, you want to nominate yourself?
I'm happy to let you be first. I can second.
And I'm happy to withdraw my name from consideration to make it go easier.
Any further comments from the committee members or the public?
Just a point of J. Powell, a question of clarification, Mr. Tomasulo. Is it Tomasulo?
Tomasulo, yes.
You mentioned something to do with undergrounding utilities. You had some work that you.
Yes, I work for a water agency, water utility. So installing primarily my career is installing water utilities. Water utilities, you know, conflict with all the other utilities. So I've had to work and make agreements with SDG&E coordinating projects back and forth over the years.
Okay, so you've had work with SDG&E and
agreements where we have either projects that conflict or they have to work around our utilities and vice versa. As a special district, Helix does not own the franchise rights in the streets, so there's no franchise agreements. It's just utilities coordinating each other.
so the other work that you've done outside of that has not been dealing with.
Point of order, guys,
Yeah.
the public comment period has closed for the meeting. This is now a period of time for the committee to discuss amongst themselves and ask questions of themselves before they hold a vote. If you want to add additional commentary, comments during the non-agenda public comment period, Jay, you are welcome to do that.
Okay, I'm confused about the process here.
The public comment period ended when the last person in public comment that was on the Zoom finished, and then this is the point of discussion for nomination.
Regarding the chairmanship.
That was dividing the vice chair.
Chair.
We've done the
Okay.
chair already.
Right. Just thought, I wanted to make sure that there wasn't a conflict of interest here. With the undergrounding program that the city was engaged in.
I appreciate that, and you are certainly welcome to make that concern known in non-agenda public comment. There's another period at the end of the agenda for that statement, for statements regarding that to be made. Okay, sure. For ease of keeping the minutes,
Sure.
can the members of the committee please specifically name the person they're voting for vice chair, since we just had that quick
Sure.
step change?
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, we will now take a vote. Member Browning,
I'm voting for Thomas Wu.
Member Kolar,
Light of Jared's comments and Jim's offer to serve as vice chair, I am voting for Jim Tomasulo.
thank you. Member Quinn,
Mr. Thomas.
and Member Thompson.
I vote for myself. Thank you.
All right, that's 4 in favor of Member Tomasulo. Member Tomasulo has been elected vice chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. The next item on our agenda is an informational item. Staff presentation on the franchise agreement. Go ahead and put the slides.
Hi, all. My name is Heather Werner. I'm the Deputy Director for Energy in the Sustainability and Mobility Department. We are, as you know, the administrative oversight department that works and coordinates with SDG&E regarding the franchise. We also coordinate amongst our various different city departments in their interactions with SDG&E as it relates to projects in the public right of way. So a little bit of history. I'm going to have Megan do slides since thank you. Little bit of history on the franchise, kind of where we are with the current agreement, how we got here. The first, kind of the most recent franchise prior to this one was released in 1970. It was a 50-year franchise that expired in June 2020. The undergrounding program and related surcharge and fees were added in 2001. And that franchise was extended 1 year to finalize the bid terms and negotiations on the current franchise. The current franchise was awarded via ordinance. It came into effect July 8th, 2021. It's what's known as a 10 plus 10 year agreement. The second 10-year term is automatically renewing unless there is a 2/3 vote by council to change, amend, or end that second term. That process is very detailed and delineated in the franchise agreements. There are technically 2 franchises in question. There's the electric franchise and the gas franchise. If you look at the ordinances side by side, they are pretty much parallel. There's specific examples of differences when it comes to the technical aspects of what you're actually installing in the public right of way. The revenue for the franchise comes in, it's 3% of gross receipts annually plus $10 million. Those $10 million are spread across the first 5 years of the franchise and then the last 2. It establishes this committee, the Compliance Review Committee. It also directs the development of an administrative MOU. I'll go into a little bit more of detail on that. The development of an undergrounding MOU, and it acknowledges the development and signatures of the Energy Cooperation Agreement. That was actually an agreement executed mayorally between SDG&E and the city in late May. So that process ran in parallel to the actual franchise itself. So it is referenced in the franchise documents themselves. Slide. So the franchise controls, general rule for this is at any point, if there's any conflict or aspects that are unclear in any of these three supporting documents, the franchise language does control. The three main supporting documents to the franchise are the administrative MOU. That really is the administrative practices and timelines. That really gets into the details of how the city and SDG&E work together regarding their projects in the public right of way. It really affects two main sides of the projects. The first being the permitting process for SDG&E. A lot of detail around permits on small projects versus major works that they're doing. And that's primarily led by our Development Services Department. And then their field condition, the actual work and construction. That's mainly our field engineering team and construction management team in our engineering and capital projects. Those are your two big pieces to that. It also details data sharing expectations. One of the big things that was added to this franchise is SDG&E's requirement to provide as-built data to the best of their ability to the city in real time or on a regular basis. That has been provided via a GIS layer, GIS data that was how that was going to work, and access controls, et cetera, is detailed in the admin MOU. And then it kind of outlines procedures and responsibilities regarding infrastructure coordination when the city has a project, SDG&E has stuff there, or vice versa, and how we make sure that we are actually being the most effective and efficient. It has built into it a 2-year review, amend, and execute cycle. So the administrative MOU gets reopened every 2 years. We'll go through the timeline on that in just a minute. And how it plays into this committee's timeline, because they run a little bit in parallel. The second document is the undergrounding MOU. This is establishes all of the processes and detailed requirements around the undergrounding program, and specifically the fee. That is its own bucket of money that everyone will note is on their electricity bill. And that splits the projects into how the process runs when the city is going to design and construct, and then SDG&E simply does kind of wiring and interconnection, as opposed to a project that SDG&E takes the design and construction of. And there are different kind of parameters and parallels of what that process looks like and why the decisions kind of go into those two buckets, and what the reimbursement and payments all look like. There was a significant portion of this MOU dedicated to a need for SDG&E to update its accounting system so that we ensured that no undergrounding surcharge money was being used outside the city boundary. And SDG&E has been working toward that. And then the last one, as noted, is the Energy Cooperation Agreement. The Energy Cooperation Agreement really outlines and details a number of commitments by SDG&E and the city to cooperate on areas that are of mutual interest, but are not subject to specific work in the right-of-way. A franchise is specifically about that geographic area. So these are operations and areas of cooperation and coordination outside of that specific area of work. It includes alignment with the CAP, coordination with SDCP, coordination with our fire department and Office of Emergency Services when it comes to wildfire safety and planning, equity programs, and then regular meetings and presentations to council and committees, city staff, and to you all. And so there's a lot in that transparency section of the ECA. We do a lot of SDG&E has a lot of presentations, 2 of which are going to Environment Committee tomorrow, if you want to just dial in and listen. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the timing of all of this and the various different reports in question as they relate to this committee. So the franchise compliance period is a 2-year period. That means we are currently coming to the end of the first compliance period. It ends on July 7th of this year. At that point, the timer starts on an independent audit, and I'll give a quick update on that in the next slide. An independent performance audit of SDG&E per the terms of the franchise and those 3 supporting documents that we just went through. That is due to this committee no later than 120 days after the end of the compliance period. So that is the 5th of November. And similarly, This committee is then responsible for including that audit report in a larger report regarding compliance and recommendations for improvement on SDG&E's compliance and its coordination with the city. That's due 60 days after. So effectively, it's due 180 days at the end of the compliance period. So those recommendations are due to council on the 3rd of January of the next year. To note, we actually anticipate that the auditor will be under contract this fiscal year in advance of July. So their work actually will likely start before then, but the deadline for them to get you guys their audit report is the 5th of November. Similarly, you all can develop and start working on your report of other things in advance of getting that auditor's report.
No question.
Yeah.
How is the independent auditor chosen?
I'll get into that just one second. So that's the current compliance period. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
I just got a question. So the independent auditor is going to develop their report, got 120 days to do that. And then we are going to pick up and do a report on the independent auditor's report and embed the independent auditor's report within our report for presentation to the council.
Megan, can you move the picture? So you review the auditor's report and include the report. You guys provide a written report for recommendations to city council. So if there are things around or your take on or things to note in the auditor's report. So your report can include highlights of that audit report, but also other recommendations regarding activities of SDG&E or the city for compliance with the franchise that may or may not have been subject to a formal audit performance because they don't follow strict auditing guidelines.
I guess what I'm really asking, will the independent auditor be able to present
Yes.
their
Yes.
findings directly to the council?
I will, yes, and yes, they will. I will get to that in just a second. So to note, the thing that starts the new admin MOU is the submission of SDG&E's two-year plan of major projects they know are going to be happening in the city in the 2 years prior. That initiates the renegotiation, or we reopen the admin MOU, edit, and then re-execute it. Right now, our current timing for that is April. I'm going to look back to our public, which includes our rep from SDG&E, where we're likely going to do that. And then that we have about 60 to 90 days to renegotiate that. The new compliance period then starts on July 8th, 2023. So there will be, I think the timing of this one is a little strange to stick a pin on it of your guys' recommendations may or may not be able to, this is one of the reasons when you talk about your work plan, about what you want to hear when and what those conversations are to inform those conversations, even if they're not formally part of your report. Because the report ends up informing the next MOU. And that's just kind of how the timing of the franchise was.
And so one question I have is, and obviously the timing is quick, but were we to prioritize the administrative MOU?
That is subject to the committee.
So so if we were to do that, would we be able to comment or provide any feedback in advance of that MOU renegotiation that's coming up so quickly?
I think informally, yes.
Right, informal, but because our report isn't until much later, we couldn't.
Right, because also the report is to council, but the admin MOU is executed administratively.
Understood.
So any feedback we receive from the CRC would be informal regardless, because your report is to council, which it's a parallel process. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you could back, by the way, I'm Lord Levy, I'm with the city attorney's office.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
I'm helping Heather with this matter. May we back up one slide? I want to emphasize one thing too here. These three, the admin MOU, the undergrounding MOU, and the energy co-op agreement, they're adjunct to the franchise, but they are part of the franchise. So I just want to emphasize that.
Just a follow-up question to that. So the audit that's referenced in the ordinance that implemented the franchise agreement is that is with respect to all.
Including these three
Representation.
documents, yes.
So franchise is synonymous with these three separate adjunct agreements.
Inclusive of, not synonymous with.
So for purposes of the audit.
They will include all three documents, yes.
Because there's a lot of representations and commitments. within
Now,
those
the audit, my anticipation would be that would focus on fiscal matters such as, what their gross revenues were and what they made in the way of franchise payments to the city and what the surcharge collections were and so on, fiscal matters. Some of these other things like, cooperation with community choice power, that might be a little more amorphous, in terms of what an auditor would typically audit, so those types of subjects might be things that are outside the sphere of the auditor, that this committee might want to focus on.
That was my thought. I just gave a quick read to their cooperation agreement.
Right, but it is not as if this
Hold on
committee.
just a second. I actually want to respect the fact that we actually have to get through this, do public comment and then have this conversation. And that, no, and it's easy to let that slide. So I do want to be respectful of the public comment going on as well. So one more slide, let's just jump down. So current status. So the independent auditor RFP, that RFP was released. We did receive proposals. It has closed. We are now going through the kind of ranking and grading, et cetera. We anticipate that the audit contract should be executed by the end of March. That might be a little aggressive because I'm hopeful. But that is, and the RFP does include both the report itself and 3 to 4 presentations of its findings, one of which is assumed to be at this committee, another assumed to be at council, and potentially if the decision of council is to send your report and recommendations along with the audit to a committee, that would be your third. So this committee, Environment Committee is the council committee that oversees all things franchise, and then full council. So yes, the auditor will be there with one in person to present to you all, and then also be able to present on their findings for any presentation that council requests if they request a formal informational item docketed on your guys' report rather than simply a written report. And whether that is the request or not, we're still a little TBD. One of the other meetings that is required under the ECA is a quarterly meeting with the COO, between the COO and staff and the senior executives of SDG&E. That is usually Scott Kreider, who's a senior vice president. Our last COO meeting did include the president of SDG&E, and then we present annually to committee on a wrap up of those quarterly meetings. That is one of the 3 presentations being given at Environment tomorrow. The other 2 you'll note are updates on customer equity programs. That's once a year. Climate equity, that's twice a year. And then they have a rate transparency presentation to council. Every year, you'll note the dates of those 2 that have passed, and major projects and undergrounding. That's twice a year. So those are targeted for, the next round of those are anticipated in April and May. There is also, as part separate from the franchise fees, there is a commitment by SDG&E for a $2 million annual payment from shareholder funds for the first 5 years of the franchise directly to the Climate Equity Fund, which is a fund, a dedicated pocket of money in the city. Those have been received, so just wanted to confirm that they are in compliance with those. And similarly, a solar equity program, that was their last climate equity presentation, and that has been set up and launched by the Center through the Center of Sustainable Energy last summer. That is it. I think that's the last slide, isn't it? Oh, sorry, next steps. So public comment on this presentation. Happy to answer any further questions from the committee. That closes this item. And then the next one really is with a note to these dates, what you all want to discuss and vote on as your work plan. And I think the only required vote is establishing the next meeting date or the meeting cadence as you so choose. And I think Megan's going to give you more details on that. So with that, that ends the presentation. If you want to open it to public comment.
Thanks, Heather. Do we have any public comment?
Yep, Lori Saldana.
Actually, it's a question. How can the public access that PowerPoint slide presentation you just provided?
It'll be updated on the committee webpage after the meeting.
Okay, so the public needs that before the meeting, don't you think? I think that if you're going to be providing us with documents to prepare for the meeting so we can review it and have questions, we need that as part of the packet that you post. And I looked on the website and I can see the agenda posted. You said everything that was relevant was already on the site, but now you're saying that file's not on the site.
The presentations to council, to committee, to commissions, those are added to the item following their presentation, usually because they're potentially last minute updates. So we will add them to the committee's website to be made public after the meeting.
Okay, so that's a little different than the agendas I'm used to reviewing. Also, just to point out, you said that it takes a supermajority of 6 votes to overturn the franchise agreement. Is that per city charter?
That's per the franchise ordinance.
A city attorney, is that consistent with the city charter?
Section 103 of the city charter says that that franchises may be granted by the council by ordinance of the council upon recommendation of the manager. And an ordinance requires 6 votes. So to grant the franchise requires 6 votes.
Oh, right, but they said,
To end the franchise takes 6 votes
and you said by the manager? City manager?
by the council upon recommendation of the manager.
Okay, so the charter specifies that a supermajority is required to end a franchise agreement?
That's correct. In this case, it would be. Yeah.
Only in this case?
This franchise was granted by an ordinance. If the city determined to end this franchise early, it would take a similar ordinance to end it early.
Okay, thank you.
It would take 6 votes.
Yes,
And that's also in the ordinance that was passed, outlines that
That's not in the
process.
charter.
the charter requires 6 votes to grant a franchise.
No, but not to ungrant.
To undo the grant of this franchise would take 6 votes.
I mean,
He's saying
He's
6
legal.
by supermajority, but that's not in the charter, it's in the ordinance. So we have a conflict between the ordinance and the charter.
That's my reading of the charter.
Okay, and I couldn't hear your name when you introduced yourself earlier. Can I get you?
Ortlieb, ORTLIED.
And then public comment, Jay Powell.
thank you. I just one question about the quarterly meetings, which I think you're going to report on tomorrow at environment. Are those meetings published and are they open to the public?
No,
Is there a reason why those meetings are not open to the public?
that was not the agreed terms under the energy cooperation agreement.
That was not the agreed terms under.
Those are, the energy cooperation agreement identifies a meeting between senior staff of SDG&E and the COO of city staff to
Or his
coordinate
design-
on city operation,
Or his designated,
or his designated staff member, yes.
okay. And so if there's minutes of those meetings, those are not available to the public either?
There are no minutes to those meetings.
So,
I mean, the agendas are public, they're in that item for environment, so you can see those.
well, are they published for the public to know when the meeting is held?
No, because it's not a public meeting.
I see. So just at the annual report to the environment committee is the first time the public knows what we're talking about with SDG.
For those specific meetings, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comment?
Not in person.
All right, turning online, if you would like to speak to agenda item number 5, please raise your hand by either tapping the raise your hand icon or by dialing *9 on your phone. I am not seeing any public comments online. So are there any comments from the committee?
I had a question.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about the $10 million for equity, was that the same 10 million?
No, it is separate. So the 10 million was the bid price. That's spread over those 70 years. That is a component of the franchise fee that goes directly into the general fund.
Uh-huh.
This was a separate agreement that was part of the SDG&E bid that was funds specifically for the CEF. So they are the same amount, but they are 2 different buckets of money.
And is it a one-time for the?
It is 2
Social equity?
million. The climate equity fund is 2 million per year for 5 years.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So there was a bid that SDG had to make?
Yes, they did.
Can you give us a little background on that? Maybe
So the bid, we can certainly make, I think the bid documents are actually up, but we can certainly resend them to the bid, the proposal, what the IT
What was the scope they were bidding on? I mean, is it?
This is a somewhat complex question, but the other feature of section 103 of the charter, which I just cited for purposes of the grant, it says 6 foot or a supermajority of the council is required to grant the franchise. A similar number would be required to pass an ordinance to repeal the franchise. But also that section says that the franchises may be awarded by ordinance of the council upon recommendation of the manager after an opportunity has been provided for free and open competition. Okay. What happened in 1970 is the city sent out a invitation to bids, which had prescribed franchise terms. And there some legacy history with what happened back in 1970, but the short story is effectively the same thing happened in 2021 and at the end of 2020, which is SCGD was non-responsive to the invitation to bid, took exception to certain terms. And that happened once in this cycle at the end of 2020. Its bid was rejected for not being responsive, and then it submitted a bid on the second iteration, which resulted in a negotiated franchise. There were no other bidders after an opportunity for free and open competition had been presented. That state of affairs was recently litigated by certain parties in court, and so far the city's process has been upheld.
We can, if there is interest, we can provide the invitation to bid documentation that was released. It's also, I think, on the website still, as well as SDG&E's bid response.
So the agreement we're reviewing was competitively bid and then negotiated.
That's right, because there weren't any other bidders.
Right.
That is not to say that SDG&E readily accepted all the city's terms.
I have a question. You mentioned in response to public comment that the franchise could be overturned, or I guess essentially repealed by a vote of 6-3 or supermajority vote. My read of it was that 6-3 vote applies to the automatic renewal. Would it also apply to if the city council decided
Any repeal of the ordinance, any change of this ordinance granting the franchise took 6 votes. It's an ordinance, and so to modify an ordinance requires an ordinance.
Yes, understood.
There is another section in there similar beyond the repeal that reserves the reservations of right the city can choose, should it choose to go down the path of what's currently commonly known as public power municipalization.
Correct, yeah.
But to Francis' point, that
would also,
it still requires
that
us
would
to
still
act.
take 6-3. Understood.
So just to clarify, there are two things there though, right? The city has the right, city council has the right to repeal the franchise agreement at any time with a 2/3 vote.
That's right.
The provision with respect to automatic renewal only takes place after 10 years.
That's right.
So
And the franchise itself, has, as Heather mentioned, has complex terms about, when the city might make such a determination and what its obligations might be in that event if it were to proceed in that way.
And so this committee, as I read it in the adopting ordinance, is charged with providing recommendation with respect to that automatic renewal. Which
The
having said that,
end goal, yes.
so every 2 years, this committee will provide a recommendation with respect to that automatic renewal provision that takes effect 10 years after adoption of this franchise agreement.
I think that's a correct interpretation. The purpose of the compliance review committee is to recommend to council, is to report to council on SDG&E's compliance with the franchise and any recommendations they're under based on that for either the automatic renewal or potentially other areas for cooperation or coordination if you choose to.
At the 10-year interval or at any interval, really. So that's the point. I think the real intent of this provision of the new franchise is that the last franchise went 50 years without anybody really looking hard at what was happening.
So we're not charged with renegotiating this.
No.
It's just reviewing the audit, the compliance, and reporting on how 2 years.
And that's what I just want to make sure, clarify anyway, in reading this, we're not to really comment on whether or not the council should consider repealing the franchise agreement. Rather, we're giving advice.
Well, I mean, so what I'm hearing from the city attorney's office is that what you said was that our mandate is to provide any recommendations we want to the council in sort of within the period. Clearly, the 10-year renewal isn't happening for quite some time. And it sounds like per the charter, the franchise could be repealed by a vote of 6-3 before that. What we find and what we determine, I think we can make whatever recommendation we want.
I think the other thing to anticipate is that the compliance review committee is also reconstituted every 2 years.
Right.
So I think the idea is, the intent, to Fritz's point, is throughout the compliance period, they're effectively, the 10 and 10 was, an understandable kind of correct, although SDG&E might disagree, they might have wanted 50 years, period of a franchise, given the level of capitalization you're talking about and the level of delivery of service. But significantly more oversight of whether SDG&E is consistently staying in compliance with the terms of the franchise and its supporting documents. And so your report out is about that question. Then 10 years, or should something happen that triggers that discussion at council earlier, those reports are on record for council to review as the advisory body for council regarding SDG&E compliance and any future actions taken regarding the franchise via some other municipalization or other method, or discussions with SDG&E regarding either the second 10-year term, a new franchise, at whatever council so therefore chooses to do. Did I say that right?
I think you're right. And although, as Heather mentioned, the committee is reconstituted every 2 years, I think the idea is to develop a continuum of review.
Mm-hmm.
And so if things are grave or serious, even at an early interval, that might rise to the level of certain recommendations that this committee wants to make. If they're grave and serious problems, then the committee can form its own opinions and make its own recommendations to the council based on the context of the entire history.
So I was only asking because when I read this ordinance, what's the charge of this committee? And it's spelled out in one sentence. It says, the committee shall provide a recommendation to the city council on the question of automatic renewal for the secondary term of the franchise. Based on compliance. And that's where it stops.
Let me give you some legislative history behind that provision. That came from the advertised prescribed version of the franchise that the city advertised. Evidently, that was not a portion, that those words were not negotiated in the eventual franchise that resulted. So it is making reference to this hard delineation of the 10 years. In the original iteration of the franchise was that the second 10 years were dependent on the first 10 years of performance. That is no longer the case under the negotiated franchise. The 20 years is firm, except for this 10-year interval, of review. But then there are refund obligations those are the other provisions in the franchise that it's kind of alluded to here, as coming into play if the city ends the franchise early.
So not to make too much of this, but I asked because members of the public, council members might speak to this committee and encourage them to repeal the franchise agreement. And strict reading of this would tell me that's beyond the scope of this committee. And so that's why I asked.
The couching of the recommendation is, for example, hypothetically, like the committee were to say after the first 2-year review period that the recommendation is to end it now, it might be couched in reference to the actual language. There is, they're not on track to get the second 10 years if they continue on this pattern of conduct.
Yeah, subject to the audit, right? Right. Kind of hold judgment till we see how the.
Yeah, it sounds to me like we're charged with reviewing the audit and making our own comments with respect to audit or performance or public testing.
And so, although the franchise does refer actually to the second 10-year term, there is the provision in the contract, and it's part of the actual common law that municipalities can end franchises anytime they want. They can always provide services municipally at any time. And so even though that is the charge of this committee per the franchise itself, the franchise itself also has those provisions in there for termination at any time.
One more follow-up
Yeah, of
question
course.
for you. So you mentioned during the original bid process that SDG had areas of contention. I can imagine, the various risk areas and legal areas. Is it possible for us to get a list of those areas of contention that are in the agreement so we can see how they're doing on those areas? If that may be a complex thing for you to provide.
Let me take that under submission. We'll discuss that with Heather. I
Yeah.
think, I think
Like
the committee,
indemnification or things like that,
the
but
committee should know where the parties, both the city and SDDD, where their concerns have historically been and where problems have arisen in the past, So I think the answer is probably yes.
The original, the pro forma ordinance that was part of the ITB is public, and the final ordinance is obviously public. I think what we have to take back and review is what parts of the negotiation may not be able to be presented for public because it's considered attorney confidential.
Yep.
So that's the only thing that we would want to check before responding. But we will take that back and see what as much as we can make public. Any other questions from the committee regarding kind of where we're at?
Is there gonna be a third person?
It is let's see, we have two mayoral, two council. Council has the third seat. I have not heard about a third nomination, but that doesn't preclude them from doing so. There is an open seat here, so hence quorum is kind of key on everybody's calendars.
So 3 constitutes a quorum for this committee.
3 constitutes a quorum.
Let's hope we don't all get. COVID.
Or we cancel, notice it, and create a special meeting. These are all possible. Okay, so with that, this item closes. There's no vote on this item. It's informational. Move to the next.
So agenda item number 6 is a discussion item for the committee work plan prioritization of compliance areas for review. The purpose of this item is to determine the information, presentation, and other items that the committee wishes to review at upcoming meetings. The committee meeting schedule, or at a very minimum, the next meeting date, hopefully. We're going to first open to public comment, followed by committee member discussion. So is there any comment?
This is 7.
This is 6.
Okay, Lori Saldana.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important that the public be informed about access, how to get into this meeting room, since it's a little more, it's different than many people may be accustomed to when they go to other public hearings. It requires different levels of access. And while it may be the practice not to provide those documents as part of your agenda notices, because you might change them, I think at least the first draft, it could be presented as a draft that could be changed. Because this is technical, this is complicated information, and I think the public would appreciate having in advance to be able to review it and determine if they want to submit comments or engage directly in the hearings. So, and just for background, I was a former chair of the city's Wetlands Advisory Board, and when we were created, coming up with our work plan as a new board, it is challenging. And Jay has also served on city advisory boards. But that's why we have quite a few questions, comments, and input, because we've served. I was chair of the board, and I know when you're first getting started, there's a lot that goes into it in terms of meeting the interests and needs of the public when they may have questions about what the goals and outcomes are. So given this is a very expensive endeavor, and I think the public has a right to be engaged as much as is legally allowed. So those are my suggestions on this. Thank you.
Jay Powell?
Thank you. I think one of the things I noticed appears to be is that there were certain timelines and dates that were set for the completion of certain items. I think an energy cooperation agreement implementation. And I'm not even sure that has been published yet. I would encourage the committee to seek clarity on what were the original intentions and specific dates mentioned, 90 days for completion of this and whatever number of days for completion of the different elements that you're looking at. I think the undergrounding agreement, whatever that's referred to, the MOAs, all of those stuff, I think have been trailing. And so there's an issue here in terms of, in the public interest, the issue of why are these not being concluded in a timely way in accordance with the agreements or side agreements that were either in the franchise agreement or adopted in conjunction with the franchise agreements. There's no difficulty that the city's having on their end of it. There's SDG&E. Why aren't these things happening at the time? I think that's a pretty important aspect of serving what the public is hoping to get out of the franchise agreement and other agreements. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other public comment in person?
Not in person.
Moving to online, if you would like to speak to agenda item 6, please raise your hand by using the raise your hand icon on your computer, tablet, or smartphone, or dialing *9 on your phone. I'm not seeing any folks with their hand raised. So Chair, that concludes public comment. I will hand it over to you for committee discussion.
Okay, well, I guess I'd open it to committee members with respect to, well, maybe I can start by just saying the franchise agreement collectively consisting of representations of the administrative MOU, undergrounding MOU, and the energy cooperation agreement is broad, multifaceted. So I'm wondering if it would be possible for the committee to be provided by staff with a checklist of all the deliverables under those agreements so that we can, because it says here we're going to try to prioritize what we'd like to look at, who we'd like to hear from to evaluate those items. So sorry about this. It's probably a big ask for staff, but and I don't know if the auditor's being provided with a checklist or just giving them the agreements and saying, please audit this.
We'll respond to any queries from the auditor as will SDG&E. So they would be responsible for developing their checklist or theirs. But certainly in terms of, if I can offer, given that statement, if I can offer a recommendation for discussion to the committee, is it may be useful to have as part of the work plan, especially as we're not quite at the end of the compliance term anyway, just for the next meeting's detailed dive-in discussions and presentations on each of the documents. Specifically, I know SDG&E is happy to also be present and present from their perspective, and that is anticipated. They actually, I think in the ACA, you guys have a reporting to this committee responsibility. They've just been waiting for this to get constituted in order to meet it. So that would be one thing. So that would be certainly something that I could recommend is digging down, and then we would just need to know from you, to the point you made earlier, Jared, the order in which you would want to see those, so that we can bring in the correct members of different departments or staff and the SDG&E team to go into those details and answer questions.
Yeah, sure. I have a couple thoughts. One, it seems like the auditor is going to be focused on what the audit, and that might be helpful to understand what the scope of the auditors.
I can certainly provide that. Yes.
Because clearly we'll review that and maybe have some fun with that, but there's lots of, as the chair quite aptly noted, there's a lot of ambiguous and broad sort of things for us to opine on, some of which are, is very subjective at the end of the day. One, I think focusing on the administrative MOU first, since that's sort of coming for review anyways, would make some sense, but it might be helpful to get, for example, the cooperation with CCA. It might be helpful to hear from the CCA on sort of the back and forth and sort of how they sort of their view of that and sort of state, and same with the cooperation with the climate action plan, sort of get a sort of an update from that and focus on some of the more subjective items that the auditor is not going to focus on, and have that be part of our initial scope. Some thoughts.
Other committee members?
I was just curious, did you all have in mind, like how often you thought it made sense for us to meet? Because you've lived this for a lot
So,
longer than us.
I think the only thing staff is necessarily anticipating is for those final 60 days, likely having more meetings than the period between now and say the audit report. Because just the development of the written document, and there are only 4, potentially 5 of you. So that's, that would be, other than that, it's really, I think more what are all the things desired to be covered, and then what does that look like against a calendar, and also respective of the availability of the committee. Most committees meet once a month. We can certainly start with that as a cadence, and then if necessary, we can either, there is the opportunity under the Brown Act to notice a special meeting if one needs to be added outside the regular cadence of meetings. Or if there's an action by the committee to change that cadence so that there's more meetings as needed, we can do that.
I was thinking monthly too, and Mr. Powell's comments, I can appreciate his comments, and I want to make sure we're giving the staff enough time to get the information together. So kind of need to hear from you if monthly is enough, because when we meet, we definitely want to, I'll be prepared and cover material. And there's a lot of information, the order of which I'm totally open. I kind of looking to the city to tell us what's the best. You guys got to tell us the story on one of these things, right? So what you think is the best way for us to digest a lot of information in a pretty quick time frame. But I'm committed to meeting monthly, whatever the committee wants. But I'm also looking at staff.
Sure, I think a monthly cadence is fine in terms of staff preparation. Certainly the initial presentations, if you're focused on a deep dive into each of the documents, all of these documents, all of the implementation plan, the admin review, all of these have been presented to committee and reviewed. So that those materials are fortunately just something we can pull up, no problem. And if there's questions specifically areas of the committee, you obviously can send them to Megan, so that we're prepared for those and can get any other background information as you go through them, or if you want to bring them forward now, or obviously anything that comes up, we can always return in the next committee meeting and have, if the chair chooses to have an agenda item of carryovers from the last meeting as a discussion item, which may, I think, be useful, at least for the first couple of meetings.
I'm thinking this item we're talking about right now is a good one for carryover, because I don't think we're ready to prioritize our areas. So if we could get information, we could get those deliverables that are identified, we get those kind of itemized, and give everybody a little more chance. Because I think some of us haven't had a chance to read all the agreements yet. That might provide a better opportunity for prioritizing what we want to discuss and who we might like to hear from to evaluate those, if that makes sense.
Okay. Just that, where I think you did the more recent deep dive on all the documents in terms of a checklist.
So if we need to push that next meeting out a little further.
No, it's not that. That's the president. I think the challenge is that other than the financial aspects, which to Fritz's point are very much going to be like in line with what the auditor is going to report. the different activities and the areas where they're subject, especially the ECA is a great
ECA.
example, like all of those, we can certainly do. I think a lot of it is to the timing of, do you want to go through and do a meeting that's a deep dive on all the things that were negotiated in the admin MOU, make that the first meeting? Or do you want to do a deep dive on all of the different things that are in the ECA and what is in the implementation plan, what's been implemented, what we always anticipated as future state? I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing both of those in one meeting. So I think if to your point, we don't want to necessarily develop the whole thing, and totally understood, I would probably then ask committee to determine which one of those two do you want to do first and which one do you want to do second if we're planning a February and March meeting. And we can, bring in accordingly. And again, we can kind of peel the onion on all of these as we go.
I don't know if the other committee members have thoughts. I mean, it seems to me some of these agreements are kind of like check a box. Did they make their $2 million annual contribution for the what's it called?
Climate equity.
Climate equity fund.
Thank you. Done.
Yes.
Others are much more nebulous. The city and SDG working in good faith together will achieve X, Y, and Z with prioritizing.
The ECA definitely has the most
concern. I mean, there are,
soft, less defined language.
my quick read, there's 50 of those at least, right? ECA.
And there's some of that in the main franchise as well, right?
Yeah.
As I sort of referenced earlier. Bridget, I'm curious your thoughts.
I kind of like to start hot, big picture, and then maybe narrow down more, because I feel like we might get lost in the weeds if we don't have the big picture too. And for me, scheduling, I love the third Wednesday in the afternoon. It's just better for me if it's always the same day of the month for my calendar. I don't know if
That
that
usually works, but in February it doesn't. But other than that, I sort of beyond February, I'll make it work.
Yeah. For me, it just is better if it's the same day every month. So I
Does
can
that work
pocket.
for the others?
So if that doesn't work, we can pick a different day.
I'm sort of besides February, if we do the third Wednesday going forward, I can sort of make sure it works. But February, I won't be here the third Wednesday. I will be here from the basically the second half of February.
Jim, does that
Wednesdays look good to me.
work for me? So do we want to, if we're talking about our next meeting date, do we want to pick, is there another date, Jared, that might work close to that date, or?
If we wanted to do Monday the 13th in the afternoon would work. Like this, the 3:30 on Monday the 13th. So it's somewhat in line with sort of this week.
Fine with me.
That would work for February. I have something on.
I was suggesting that the Wednesday works going
For
forward.
February, that would work for me.
Oh,
So we'll look at Monday the 13th, and then after that, the third Wednesday of the month. Just to kind
That's fine with
of
me.
put a placeholder for now, and we'll talk about every meeting, what the next one is, and make adjustments if we have to. Does that make sense?
I just looked up, sorry, and I have a conflict, but I think I can move it, so I'll move it for now. 13.
Would it be the same time, 3:30?
My appointment is at 4:30, so it's all right. It's a dental appointment. I think we can move it.
Sooner if you want.
I think that'll work.
Okay.
So are we going with 3 o'clock or 3:30?
Either's fine.
Let's do 3.
Great, okay,
Three?
so
Okay.
to confirm the next meeting. I think this takes a motion, but just to confirm, and then Cheryl, I'll let you actually do the formal stuff. February 13th at 3, and then the third Wednesday of every month
Thereafter,
follow thereafter. Okay,
until we decide.
and yeah,
I'll make the motion.
is there a second?
Second.
You have to call it.
Thank you.
Hold on, he has to call a vote.
Yeah, so that all vote. We have a motion for the next meeting on Monday, 15th at 3 o'clock, and every meeting thereafter for the time being on the third Wednesday of the month at 3 o'clock. Any members?
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Thank you. And then is there any, this is a discussion or vote or whatever is, what you would like prioritized for that first meeting? I know that we maybe
You know,
circle
you-
back to that part of the
you-
conversation.
Put the, like, kind of like the timeline with
Sure.
the admin MOU, something sooner. From recalling, was that something that would be more helpful for us to look at and address sooner than? It sounds to me like our deliverables in a year, the main deliverables, the report, right?
Yes.
But the admin MOU is something staff.
Go
is
back
working
one
on.
slide.
Is
Yes,
that still
for
in
sure.
negotiation? Are you looking for committee input on? Isn't
So-
the admin MOU?
The admin MOU current one is executed. The next one that we kind of reopen it technically it is reconstituted every year effectively. In practice, we're going to reopen the old one and start redlining. That process starts in April with the target of effectively. So the first compliance year period was a little weird because the franchise had to be awarded. That started the compliance period, and then all of the following documents had to happen after the franchise. So they all got executed in really the first 6 months, 7 months of the compliance period. We're now working to try to align. So getting the new admin MOU reestablished in line with the start of the next compliance period. So if it is of the interest of the committee to provide recommendation to staff or just informally, things that are in the current administrative MOU, updates in terms of city policy, city ordinance, SDG&E on their, how they have believed that they have met the requirements of, et cetera, we can certainly, that will start, staff can take that under advisement, and that's process starts in April.
So my only thought was if we're going to take the administrative MOU first consideration, that's the current agreement, which is in the
Yes.
process of being reconstituted. The reconstituted MOU will be the subject of the audit.
No, the current adherence to the current admin MOU, which guides the current compliance period, is the subject of the audit.
Okay, so there's the timeline.
So think of this as compliance period, first compliance period, the second one is the second compliance period.
Okay.
So all of the audit, et cetera, has to do with the compliance period prior.
And to be honest, I don't know how deep the audit is going to get into the admin MOU issues because they're not fiscal issues, they're operational issues. They're respective concerns of the parties and how they coordinate their affairs in the streets.
So they could certainly query permits submitted under, there's category 1 and category 2 for franchise permits, et cetera, but to Fritz's point, the subjective aspects of those processes would not necessarily be just because an auditor is guided by the rules of auditing.
Does that MOU, it doesn't go to council for approval?
No, it's administratively executed.
So the council may not even be that familiar with it.
It is presented as an informational item and then will be represented once the new one is updated. So again, to the point of, can staff do that? Yes, because we have the presentation that we gave that ran through a much more detailed, kind of detailed overview of the document, highlighting the pieces that were kind of interest to council. And we're specifically, I think, created either terms that did not exist or adjusted in the SDG&E's operations in relation to the city. Was what those were highlighted on. We can obviously expand that or go into different areas per the committee's interest.
If I can make a suggestion, why don't we just have them, staff present the admin MOU and what they're evaluating, what changes they're contemplating, because I think we need to understand it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the first step, have them, and then if there's something that we have questions on, we can dive into it. At least we'll just receive a report from staff, right, of what you're doing.
Sure.
So will you be presenting that, or will you bring in DSD and NCP to speak to elements of that, or what were you thinking?
We will present what it says. We can certainly request those departments make staff available regarding on its execution, certainly. If that's of interest, we can certainly do that.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And I think the intent too is to, you know, have the committee's awareness of, you know, each party's position with respect to the performance of those obligations, not only what it says, but what's happening.
Yeah, I'm interested in how they're doing with their as-bills and those types of things, because those are.
Right. And so
So,
those,
yeah, I'd like to hear what ENCP is doing, you know, how their SDG&E is supporting their work, for sure.
And this seems like it ties in with some of your past expertise as well. Can I just ask one other clarifying thing? So there are commitments made in the administrative MOU, undergrounding MOU, and the ECA. Are there also agreements and commitments made in the ordinance adopting the franchise agreement itself, with respect to the payment terms, some of which you've outlined in your presentation, that are outside of those three agreements?
The franchise fee terms are all outlined in the ordinance. I believe the CEF payment is also in the ordinance, or it's in the ECA. It's one of those two places. I don't believe that there are any fiscal transaction requirements that are not somewhere documented regarding the franchise and SDG&E operations in the public right of way that are not documented in either the franchise or one of those three supporting documents.
Yeah.
But we can, if what you're requesting from staff is, can you just show me all of the different payments SDG&E is required to make and where they live? We can happily add that to the presentation for the next meeting.
I think that could be pretty
Sure.
sweet and could be coupled with that administrative MOU overview. And then we'll effectively knock
Sure.
two of them.
Those are easy. That's an easy one to add to the agenda without taking up too much time.
For everybody else.
Yeah.
All right. It's your meeting.
I think that it's the agenda here. I think for the time being, maybe there can be a continuation of item 6, where we can prioritize our compliance areas for review, but we're getting an overview, so we're better understanding the areas that we might choose for prioritization. And so maybe we can continue that item. And sounds good to the committee, what you first for the next meeting. And maybe the meetings that follow will touch on the ECA and undergrounding MOU. And I think, I don't know if we're going to open it back up for non-agenda public comment.
I'm going to move to item 7.
Okay, so we're now moved to non-agenda public comment. At this time, are there any?
Laura Saldana?
So, thank you. I wanted to note there is a state audit underway of SDG&E in terms of how they've arrived at their rates that Tasha Berner Horvath has requested, and those results are scheduled to be made available by the California State Auditor in March. I also wanted to point out that according to the fiscal year 2024-28 outlook, the only revenues that go down in franchise agreements are for SDG&E. They decline over time. And I would like this compliance committee to take a look at why that is the case, why they decline from a peak of over $100 million a year to is estimated and projected to be $94 million a year. So if we are paying more and more, why are we getting less and less? And I think any compliance agreement or audit needs to look at those numbers to better understand why the cost of energy is going up, why we pay the highest rates in the country, why a lot of those profits go to an investment utility who's investing in fossil fuel that the Climate Action Plan of City of San Diego would like to decarbonize and move away from fossil fuels. Why are we supporting as ratepayers a fossil fuel corporation, Sempra? And why are we getting less in our franchise agreement over time? So does this comply with our Climate Action Plan mission as a city and as ratepayers in San Diego? So I would like this committee to consider, or rather, committee to take a look at how those dollars make sense. Why are we getting less money over time? And why are we paying more as ratepayers in San Diego than any place else in the country? Thank you.
Jay Powell.
Thank you. First, I have a question in terms of follow-up on this meeting. There are actually going to be minutes provided of the meeting. And then I think the other issue that's been raised, I just wanted to kind of touch on that again, is the background information being made available to the committee, also being made available and posted to the site for the public to read. So all the things that we requested, I think would be really helpful. And I have a question regarding the fifth member. I didn't quite hear, is that a mayoral appointment? Or
It's a council appointment.
so the city council is not appointed to fulfill the charge of this committee to have the full membership. Thank you. And I think the other comment I wanted to make was in terms of, I believe there's language which there's some of the committee members referring to as maybe nebulous, but it has to do with cooperation on policy issues with the city. And an example of non-cooperation, I believe, would be the city passed a resolution to support rooftop solar in the NEM position the city took, and SDG&E was funding and operating in opposition. So these are the kinds of things I think that the committee needs to take into account and be made aware of, either by the public or by staff. That those are my final comment is just, again, I brought up this issue of potential conflict of interest. And I think that that's still something in terms of providing background information to the record would be helpful for the public record. And even as one of the members mentioned, just having that so that they're aware of other members' involvement is. And I think there's one other issue which has to do with communications outside with SDG&E. If this committee is actually taking functioning to make recommendations on compliance. If SDG&E is having communications outside of its committee meeting with you, I think that is not inadvisable. I don't know if it's the type of thing that the city attorney could provide for guidance on to you as to how you ought to approach that. Thank you for the consideration.
Is there any more public comment on
Is there any public
So
comment?
that, please, public comment in person.
Thank you. Turning to online, if you would like to speak during non-agenda public comment, please use the raise your hand function on your screen. We have one person, Jerry Waintick.
Yeah, hi, Jerry Wanatek from Public Power San Diego and Citizens Franchise Alliance. I just wanted to find out if the committee is aware of the, I came late, so maybe you've discussed this already, of the public power feasibility study that is underway right now under the auspices of, I believe, the Sustainability Department. And to find out if, since it's part of, that was part of the franchise agreement, or not, I guess technically, but the city council instantiated it during the franchise negotiations, that if the committee is going to take it upon themselves to, for some oversight of that study, that right now, I guess, New Gen has been contracted to do it. And we've asked for the city to bring on some sort of citizens oversight of that study, but that hasn't happened yet. So I just wanted to know if this committee was, if it was in your scope, and if not, if you think it might fall under your scope. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm not seeing any other public comment online. That's it. Right.
Before adjournment, I just want to, following up on the public comment, I wonder if it would be reasonable for staff. I think it's a fair request to have meeting materials and minutes if possible, maybe 3 to 5 days in advance of the meeting. Is that something that we could do?
Just to the same point, the presentation wasn't provided to you guys either, because usually
Yeah.
presentations are, but
Right,
any follow-up
going forward.
materials or et cetera, sure.
To the extent,
Yes, and minutes have to be posted per subject of the Brown Act. So the committee and documents and all of that are in compliance, are all followed in compliance with Brown Act requirements.
and then just one other operational thing, this committee is subject to the Brown Act. And so to the extent, and to another point that was raised, or we'd be to be approached by a SDG&E official that just wanted to share information with us, or if any two of us wanted to go sidebar on something that came up in the committee, what are our Brown Act limitations? Because I've forgotten.
Well, that's difficult to answer in the absence of specific facts, so
Okay.
I can't really venture that, but it is a concern. I do understand what you're saying, but we'd have to be presented with specific facts on that. And I think the same would go for city staff too. So there's two parties to this franchise, and we do want to make city staff available to you as well as as needed. And that too should be public.
Are there general recommendations or thoughts you can provide us on sort of?
We can provide
Sure.
kind of I get into regulatory, any guidance regarding ex parte communications with either party of the agreements, anything in terms of Brown Act compliance, we can request the city attorney kind of give you guys some general bullets and guidelines.
I think that's normal for committees to
Yes.
get a little Brown Act schooling before they.
That's right.
Yes, and if there's, we can certainly also schedule that for the committee or ask city attorney to do that kind of quick refresher on.
I don't know if that's jamming too much into the next meeting. I know Fred, tell me when does it?
There are all the nuances like quorums and things like that all become part of that discussion. So I don't know how long that presentation that we ordinarily get.
Kathy has about 3 different versions of it. So let us take that back, and we'll provide at minimum written materials to you guys just in advance of the next meeting so that you have some guidance. And if there's a version of the presentation, or if there's other, and again, similar to everybody being subject to ethics commission, if a specific instance comes up and you have any questions, we certainly can help direct you to the correct office of the city attorney to help provide guidance on anything like that. To Fritz's point, it is somewhat subject to each instance.
And Megan is our conduit.
Megan is your contact for that, yes.
Great.
If we want to be on the list of notices, we can email to you. Megan?
Yeah, you send it to sustainability at sandiego.gov, and we'll add that. I realize that is not on the website for the committee, so we will add that as if you have any specific feedback, comment, or queries and want to be on a notice, anything noticing regarding this committee, what to subject, and to send it to our sustainability inbox. Thank you for that. We will add that up on the website.
Just a quick follow-up, is that the same as what the city council had, admin assistance that you can sign up? So for example, I receive notice of the meetings.
Yes, because this is the first meeting, we don't have kind of the parties of interest list that we blast out about the agenda, et cetera, but we will develop that. And the way you get on that is to just email the department.
Great.
And we'll capture that and add that to the list.
I totally get how that, you're working on the presentations to the last minute. I remember those days. If you have something for us, you can put draft on it, just so.
Sure.
Yeah. That'd be helpful.
Right. Well, with that, I think we are adjourned. Thanks to all the committee members. Thanks for being in my chair. Oh,
Move to adjourn.
adjourned.
I'll second.
Nice meeting everybody.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you. Thank you for putting this together.
Thank you. Thank you for your time at your